Welcome everyone to Double Exposure Everywhere 2020. It's great to be here. I'm Angelica Das. I'm a senior associate at the Democracy Fund. We are a foundation, a private foundation that does grant making to strengthen democratic systems. I specifically work on grant making for journalism, engaged journalism, and investigative journalism. It's our pleasure to sponsor in a small way the festival again this year. And I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have Kathleen Lingo. Do you want to wave? Just make sure everyone knows who you are. Who is the New York Times editorial director for film and television. We have Katrin Einhorn, and Leslie Davis, directors and producers for oh gosh, I totally just lost my train of thought. Father, Soldier, Son, thank you. You know how when your brain is like two thoughts ahead? That's where I was. So filmmakers, but both also longtime journalists with the New York Times. Welcome. And we have Lance Oppenheim, director of Some Kind of Heaven, and Garrett Bradley, director of Time, along with many other works, both respectively. So I'm gonna skip the part where we do long bios. Y'all can find them all in on the Double Exposure website under the speakers page. Please go there to find out more about our panelists. They've all got incredible life and professional experience that you'll wanna know more about. But this way we can get right down to business. So we are here to talk about what inspired the birth of cinematic film at the New York Times. So I'd like to kick it over right away to Kathleen to ask, tell us about the last 2 years of your life as you've been immersed in this transition from OpDocs. I think most of this audience probably knows OpDocs really well, but maybe just a brief blurb to be sure.
So Katrin and Leslie's project and Garrett and Lance's project, I should just say, are from two different tracks. Garrett and Lance had made OpDocs before, and Katrin and Leslie work at the New York Times and have for many, many years in the newsroom. But just to talk about how Garrett and Lance's projects came into being. So OpDocs was started at the New York Times in 2011 as basically it was inspired by the op-ed page. You know, the opinion section is a place for writers and thinkers and artists from outside the Times, that's the important distinction, to give their thoughts and opinions on issues of the day. And one thing about the op-ed page, the physical page in the paper, is there's always a piece of art on the op-ed page. So it's always had this spirit of artistic innovation and using visuals to get into the big arguments and discussions that take place in op-ed. So it was really in that spirit that OpDocs was founded, as a place for artists and filmmakers from outside the Times to use the genre of documentary to explore issues of the day and with an artistic lens. You know, OpDocs is purposefully not newsy. I would say pretty much every OpDoc is evergreen. Even if you watch something from 2011, it's still relevant. And when OpDocs first started, it was an experiment for the Times. No one was sure if it was going to last, if it was going to work, what was this new thing. I should say that our 10th anniversary is next year, and we've worked with literally hundreds of filmmakers, published hundreds of films, you know, won accolades, had OpDocs in many, many festivals. So it's really been a success and something sort of special and unique within the Times. I should say that I joined OpDocs in 2013. The first producer for OpDocs was Jason Spinger-Koff, a filmmaker himself and a brilliant guy. And him and Lindsay Krause, you know, from the beginning, crafted it as this meeting between journalism, documentary, and art. And Lindsay has had a really important role in OpDocs, both editorially, but also with the journalism. Lindsay has fact-checked pretty much every single OpDoc that's ever been published. I always like to say she's probably one of the only people in the world and the first to fact-check a VR film. We did a lot of VR back in when that was a thing. So there's always been this spirit of like, let's take lots of risks. We had, I think we definitely made the first piece of content in the New York Times with actors, which was Notes on Blindness, which is a documentary with actors. But we've always stuck to the journalistic rigor of the Times. But with OpDocs, we proved you could do that and also really, really be creative and use different approaches to storytelling that are not what you would associate it with journalism. And I think Garrett and Lance's films really, really show how far you can go into having your vision as a director and really using high art to tell your story and still be journalistically rigorous. And then, to talk about Katrin and Leslie, they're both journalists in the newsroom. Leslie worked in the video unit. Katrin was a print reporter, but also with an audio background. And I'll let them tell the whole story of how that project came to be. But just on the journalism and art point, they're both incredible journalists. But really what was so great for me to watch as they became directors and really artists in their own right, putting this film together, there was a constant tension, I think, between, telling people how to feel and letting the story play out that Leslie and Katrin dealt with in a very different way than Garrett and Lance, just because of their background and training. And I think that's really the exciting part about the Times being in documentary, is that not only are we telling stories on really important topics or exploring the human condition and the meaning of life and existential questions, but we're also really able to show sort of the limits of journalism, because there have been moments where it's been like, wait, this is going too far. But it's a really fun place for me to be, because I'm in between these two worlds and able to sort of see how far you can both push documentary into journalism and how much you can push journalism into documentary. So it's a very elastic and still forming place to be.
So Kathleen, you talked a lot about OpDocs. Can you tell us a little bit more about the transition to film and TV and how that group is different?
Yeah, so as the Times started to think more seriously about being in the film and television realm, people have optioned New York Times articles for fiction films for, decades. I think, I don't know how many, but there's many, many, many films that are based on a New York Times article. And there were really sort of two developments that pushed the company to take more of a position in film and television. One of them was the birth of all the streaming platforms, Netflix, etc. There's just so many new venues for film and television projects to be made and watched. And then when The Daily, our podcast, was launched, that was sort of the first time the New York Times made, a New York Times piece of journalism, and the main vehicle for distribution was not either the physical newspaper or nytimes.com. It was iTunes. And it's been a huge success. And one of the interesting learnings that the Times had from The Daily was a large proportion of the audience are not regular Times subscribers or readers. So by making New York Times projects and like putting them on other platforms that aren't ours, we're able to reach new audiences. So it's like a very exciting way for us to both expand ourselves creatively as an institution, but to, of course, then introduce new people to the New York Times. And the New York Times really has a history of innovation. When we started 170 years ago, it was just paper and words. And we've expanded, to photos, expanding to color photos. That was actually like a really big deal. So while the Times has a spirit of innovation, there's also so much we all do these constant gut checks. Like, are we pushing it too far? Are we getting away from our core mission? is this new thing going to somehow hurt our core thing, which is news? So all of these steps that the Times has taken into these new venues, be it OpDocs, documentary, film and TV in general, are done with like so much thought and care, and with always keeping that bar of excellence that the Times is known for. And that's like why I love these three films so much, because they really show that the Times can go into this new realm, which is documentary, and maintain standards of excellence and storytelling and telling stories that matter with impact.
Thank you. There's so many great nuggets in there that I'm going to come back to on, in particular, the questions about risk, and also how the traditional newsroom work and now this more kind of innovation in storytelling through a newsroom are influencing each other. But before we get to that, let's hear from the rest of the folks here. Katrin and Leslie, first, just want to make sure our audience knows Father Soldier Son is available for streaming currently on Netflix. Please let us know if there are any other avenues available for the audience currently. And I know not everyone will have seen it, so if we could maybe prime a little bit about the story before you go into the storytelling. And tell us a little bit about your process as journalists transitioning into making a feature film.
Hey, thanks so much for having us again. I'm gonna let Kat explain, like give us the primer for the film. I feel like we've both been working really hard to nail this, but I think Kat can do it best, so.
We never really got our elevator pitch down, which is probably like says something, but it's a film about a military family. It's a film about how war plays out in the lives of two children who never were anywhere near the war itself, but who had a father who served there. And so, you know, at the beginning, it's about how they're affected by his deployment, and then he comes home, and a lot, it's really about sort of the aftermath of that and sort of the indirect ways that the father's service plays out in the lives of these children. But it also opens up into sort of bigger, you know, more universal questions about masculinity and about, you know, what does it mean to be American? What does it mean to serve your country? These kinds of questions. You want to take it away from here, Les?
Yeah, so I feel like, you know, we had those central themes in mind when we started working on the story in 2014. I picked up from a print piece that Kat had worked on, a multimedia print photo piece that was published in 2011 about not just Brian, but his entire battalion of soldiers. So we had these questions in mind about how have his kids been impacted by his service? How will we see that play out in their lives? We really didn't expect the story to go on for as long as it would, or to become as expansive, or to see some of those answers played out in their lives in the way that they were. But as the boys grew, and as Brian was kind of searching for himself after he was wounded in Afghanistan and left the service, and really trying to find his identity after war, things just kept happening in their story. So you know, the evolution of this story into a feature film became clear within a couple of months of us following up on them, that basically we just weren't going to be able to use Katrin and I have worked in many mediums in journalism, so photography, audio, print, combinations of those things, photos with audio. And I think that one of the things that, you know, makes us good partners actually is that we really let the story guide what the medium should be in our work. And so in this case, it just became clear that telling their story over the course of 9 years, as you see the family grow up, and then ultimately 10 years in the photo essay that we published, was going to require giving audiences not only a film where they could see the start to finish evolution of these boys with their dad and their relationship, and then them finding their own identities, Brian and finding his identity, but also bringing it to people where they watch things that are that long, which is why we felt really fortunate that we got to work with Kathleen and then ultimately with Netflix to bring the story to people, you know, in a place where you go to sit on your couch and watch something that's 99 minutes long, which is not, for all the avenues to deliver a story to our audience that we have at the paper. That's not one of them. So does that answer the first question?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you embarked on this story, did you know that the New York Times would be producing and that you'd be working with Kathleen, or how did that relationship develop? Because that was pre the new film and TV group, as I understand it, right?
No, we were just doing our jobs. Honestly, we were just doing our jobs on the side. I mean, it was, you know, we had this project that we loved. It was our baby, and we just kept doing it. And we were doing other work at the same time. So we were publishing pieces, you know, and we were just sort of happy that our editors were sort of like, another trip? Yeah, sure, you know, fine. And we just kept going and going and going. And you know, at some point, we had lived through like a few possible endings of the film. Like, maybe this will be our end, maybe this will be our end. But we really wanted it to be off platform. As Les was saying, we just knew that the New York Times website was not the right home for the film. And the fact that the Daily was having such success off platform was really helpful for us to go to our bosses and to say, look at what the Daily is doing. Like, can we also do that? And then there was just this like sort of, everything came together because the sort of the business, you know, the New York Times more strategically as a company was starting to move into this film, you know, film in a bigger way. And so everything sort of came together. And that's when Kathleen came on, and we, you know, took it to Netflix, and Netflix came on. And then Les and I got to do something like really special, which is basically like decamp for a year and make the film. And that was like so different than our regular jobs. The rest of it really felt like our regular jobs. But the fact that we were able to like build the film with our brilliant editor, Amy Foote, was just really an incredible time.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like an incredible luxury in a way, or a dream, I guess, as a filmmaker to be afforded that time. So can I ask, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit here, but I just have to ask, when you came back from that year, did you approach your regular reporting differently? Or how did that change the way you looked at kind of some of the more traditional journalism mediums?
I mean, I think that because Katrin and I are both working on things that are coming out at a much faster pace now, so I've become very thoughtful and methodical in pulling selects and organizing, and you have to undo a little bit of that to meet your deadlines. So that kind of is a bummer, honestly. I think that we're both always going to be looking for stories at the Times that we can bring to Kathleen and say, like, we think, Kat and I both think pretty expansively about stories and really want to be able to invest time with our subjects, even if, you know, to meet the needs of the paper and to do our jobs, we're also doing a ton of other stories and putting things out on deadline in the meantime. But I think that a lot of the lessons we learned from working with Amy, like Kat said, we had a really incredible editor, but we also had amazing producers who helped us to think more creatively about, you know, the ways that characters can represent things. Or Jeff Richman was our consulting editor, and he really helped expand the way that I think we will think and edit our stories forever. And so, Kat, do you think it's changed the way that you're thinking about your new stories?
You know, I think one of the lessons that I most took away from that was pacing. So it's like, pacing is so different when you're telling a story at 90 minutes as opposed to, you know, what we're doing. And that was, that's sort of the most exciting thing, is playing with pacing. But no, now, you know, I am back in like a much tighter storytelling framework, let's put it that way. So, you know, it just expands and contracts, I guess.
Again, lots more to follow up on there, but I want to make sure that we get to all the voices here. So Garrett, if I could go to you next. Director of Time, I believe, premiered at Sundance this year and is getting released today. Am I right about that? On Amazon Prime? Tomorrow on Amazon.
Yeah.
But yay, congratulations. Could you, once again, for our audience who hasn't had access to the film yet, set the stage a little bit, and then tell us about how you came to work with the Times?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I also, I'm not. This is like, that's like more than a question to ask a filmmaker, because they get into, I think, a real place of insecurity of like, am I pitching right now? I don't know. You like get all insecure, at least for me, I do. But I mean, really Time is a love story. It's the extension of several different ideas that I can talk to as well around, you know, the issue of incarceration from a family's perspective. Film is about the Richardson family, who are in New Orleans, Louisiana. And it's really us bearing witness to a 21-year effort in reuniting each other, reuniting their families. And I came to it because I was actually, and I don't remember what year this was, Kathleen, but I didn't know anybody at the New York Times. I knew that you could submit an idea directly to their website. And I had made a film back in 2014, which was my first narrative feature-length film called Below Dreams. And I had cast that film almost entirely off of Craigslist at the time, not because I thought that was like a cool idea, but because I just didn't have any access to casting agents or directors. Like nobody cared at all. And it was a great way to meet people and develop relationships, and certainly ended up helping me to kind of develop a real community too in New Orleans and in Louisiana. And so one of the actors in the film, I remained very close with him and became very close with his partner, Lon. And several years later, I think it was around 2016, he was arrested and then was awaiting trial in a private prison for about a year and a half. And so Lon essentially became like a single mother overnight. And I felt that it was really important to make a film that was, you know, from her perspective. And for me, it really opened up ideas around how can we create as many different entry points around the issue of incarceration. And one that is maybe from a sort of feminist, Black feminist Southern point of view, one that is from the point of view of the family, which oftentimes are those who are the only ones that are able to speak and sort of prove what has become almost an invisible community as a result of the way that the system is set up. And so in the process of, you know, I submitted this idea, Kathleen emailed me back and was like, yeah, let's do it. And I remember just being so, it had always actually been a dream of mine to, growing up, I had really wanted to be like a photojournalist. I'd always, you know, just dreamed of being able to travel the world and tell stories with images. And so it was a really big deal for me that Kathleen responded to my inquiry. And then I had an opportunity to make a film. And I was really surprised and I think incredibly lucky that Kathleen and Lindsay and Andrew and the team really trusted the way in which I wanted to tell that story. And so I think, I'm sorry if I'm dancing around here a little bit, but once Alone was finished, it became really important, I think, for me to think about how can I continue to extend that conversation, you know, that understanding sort of what's happening in our country from a statistical standpoint, from a chronological and more linear and legal and legislative standpoint is incredibly important, but it's one entry point. And I think we want to make it as sort of unequivocal as possible, unavoidable as possible. And so in order for people to open themselves up to the reality of 2.3 million people being incarcerated, we need to be able to offer different ways in which they're willing to engage with that fact. And so the human experience, the emotional experience, the effects of the facts are incredibly important. And so I really had thought of Time as another 13-minute short op-doc as being a sister film to Alone. So a lot of the aesthetic choices and sort of visual choices were just directly extrapolated from Alone. And it turned into a larger project actually once I thought we were done. Like on our last day of filming, I remember saying to Fox, okay, I'm gonna come back in a few months and I'll show you what we have. And she handed me about 100 hours worth of her own personal home videos, her home archive, which I wasn't aware existed. And it completely broke open the entire editorial process, the whole conceptual process to a certain extent, of how we wanted to approach the material with Gabe Rhodes, who's the film's editor. So, and Concordia Studios Also, I was in a fellowship with them where it was very much about, like, as a filmmaker, where was I in my practice? What were some key kind of things that I felt like I needed in order to expand where I was at? I had never worked with an editor before. So there were a lot of really amazing things where the New York Times and Concordia were able to kind of come together and help facilitate this growth of the project, which I think none of us really had initially anticipated.
Thank you. Again, once again, a lot to pick up on there. I'm going to come back to it. But first, want to make sure we get to Lance. Director of Some Kind of Heaven, I believe, also premiered at Sundance this year. And I don't know where we can see it yet. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, again, set the stage. And then I have a question for both you and Garrett to follow.
Yeah, thank you for it's an honor to be here. I'll get to the movie in a second, but I too was obsessed with OpDocs for like the longest time, and maybe I'm telling this out of order, but like it's surreal to be here because one of the first, when I was in high school, where I think it was right when I had graduated high school, I had seen Garrett's film Alone. That was like one of the things that made me be like, I want to make one of these movies with this company, with this paper that is allowing like these kinds of stories to exist, and from this sort of approach. So it is an honor to be here, and thank you. But yeah, my film, Some Kind of Heaven, it's coming out in January through Magnolia Pictures. So it'll be in theaters, it'll be online, it'll be like on your Apple Watch if you have one of those. I think you can watch movies on there. Please don't watch this movie there. But Some Kind of Heaven looks at a very now infamous world, a place called The Villages. It's the largest retirement community in America, and the film the film's more, the film deals with, I guess, it deals with people who kind of are existing on the margins of this, what I think is a fantasy world, or a bubble that kind of recalls a lot of the really frightening kind of visions of like what America used to be like, like the good old days, or this kind of 1950s Americana perfection that I think draws so many people, hundreds of thousands of people from all over the country, to basically spend the last decade of their life inside of a fantasy. So, to me, I'm from Florida. I grew up hearing about this place for so long. Not only did I hear about about it politically, sort of how, like how racially homogenous the place was, I guess more of the hedonistic sort of aspects of the community, the people who were kind of going there and, seeing it as the last hurrah and partying. I was really interested after I left Florida and I was in college. I wanted to I made a film with the New York Times that explores a man who was living, he spent the last 20 years of his life on a cruise ship. And I followed him around for a bit, and I was really kind of interested existentially, like what that can kind of do to you. What does it do to the way you dream? What does it do to the way you even see yourself in the life you led before? And to me, The Villages was this kind of like, as a project of urban designs, like it was a place that was just, kind of like this late stage capitalistic, like in some ways, in my mind, like a nightmare in some ways. For some people, I think like what we're trying to do with the title of the film, it really is a heaven. It's like it's kind of this prepackaged fantasy that so many people buy into. But when I moved there and I was living there and I got to know so many folks there, I became really interested more generally in just, what does it mean to live, like literally you've bought into this fantasy. This is the last 12 years maybe of your life, and you hate it. It's like, what happens when that happens? So the movie ended up kind of becoming, it was one thing before I guess, it became another thing. But the film really is about, real people going through like really real problems in a really hyper real or fantastical place. And, you know, as I was saying before, I came, you know, I honestly, I came to OpDocs being just like a huge fan of so many of the films that were there. Garrett's film, there was a filmmaker, Joris Debeji, he made a film called The Bull Rider and Perfectly Normal. And there's, you know, there's not to mention like so many other films that I just was like just consuming and becoming obsessed with, not only the kinds of stories that were being told, but the language and the I guess just the array of different ways you can tell a story within the form of what you would think maybe more newsy, which is, you know, it wasn't. So I sent like a bunch of different emails through that submissions portal. I ended up like kind of stalking Lindsay Krause and found like her Twitter, and then I found her email, and I like sent a few more emails, and then I was like, please, let's get coffee. I love the stuff you guys do. I really want to make stuff with you guys. I have all these ideas. And then over the course of a few years, I made 3 short films with them. And kind of like Garrett, you know, this film, Some Kind of Heaven, started off as what I thought would be a short. And very quickly, I think like at the end of our first shoot, it became pretty apparent that there wasn't, you know, that there would just need to be, I didn't feel like the types of stories that we found were just continuing to actively happen, and I wanted to kind of keep going back. And right around that time, Kathleen had just formed I remember seeing like her Facebook status actually that was like, we're making TV and film, and I was like, whoa, like how do we do this? We need to figure this out. And yeah, you know, I think what became what was started as a short became a really kind of like, you know, the highlight of all the work I think I've been trying to do. And just one of the most like amazing experiences working with a production company like the New York Times, but also working with Protozoa Pictures and Darren Aronofsky, who had produced the film, and the Los Angeles Media Fund, who also got involved too. But yeah, I'm gonna stop babbling.
No, that was great. I just want to give a quick disclaimer. We do not endorse stalking in any way.
No.
Please always be respectful.
No,
I know you were just saying that in jest, but just want to make sure everyone's clear on that. We do live in an age of where online relationships can be challenging. But moving on, Lance and Garrett, what was it like for you as filmmakers to realize a relationship with a traditional, one of arguably the most traditional newsrooms in the country? And how did you understand journalistic practice in your filmmaking? We tend to automatically sort of go to the fact-checking lens, and feel free to talk through that, but I'm also curious beyond that low-hanging fruit.
Can I just make one clarification?
Sure.
Which is that Lance and Garrett weren't working with the New York Times newsroom. It was through Opinion, which is separate from the newsroom. And I think that's an important distinction. Opinion is a place, it's still journalism, because a lot of people ask me this question, like, oh, is it still journalism? Like, journalism can't have an opinion. And that's actually completely false. Journalism can have an opinion, and opinion journalism is what OpDocs and Op-Ed and the editorial page are part of. So just wanted to make that clear, because I think there is a difference, and I think it would be interesting for Katrin and Leslie to weigh in, because they were doing it through the newsroom, but just want to make clear that they are separate.
No, thank you. That's really important. Especially right now, I think we are in an environment where that level of kind of literacy, even for folks who are very familiar with consuming traditional news, has been a little bit lost in the fog. So I really appreciate that distinction. But yeah, let's hear from Garrett and Lance, and then Katrin and Leslie on this.
Well, I can jump in on that. I mean, I think as a visual person, as a filmmaker who's coming into the context of journalism and documentary filmmaking, and I think specifically addressing that question in the context of incarceration, I think that, you know, part of what's helped push a lot of the conversation and white allyship that we're seeing specifically in 2020 and in the protests that that we experienced and participated in over the course of the summer, a lot of that I think was driven by technology, by the documentation of police brutality, and trying, even though we're finding it didn't necessarily hold everyone accountable. But it certainly is pushing the conversation forward. And I think for me, that also simultaneously reinforces the absence of optics, the absence of images around 2.3 million people who are incarcerated. And it also highlights where I think the abstraction around the facts are really important things that we need to sort of combat as filmmakers, that I think most of us have a really hard time trying to fathom what 2.3 million people looks like. What is the magnitude of that? What is the scale of that? And so in many cases, the only evidence of it is, again, in the family, is in those who are serving time on the outside. And if we think about 2.3 million people, we have to take into account and assume that there's, if not double, triple that number that are then affected by that, right? Which is a huge percentage of our population. And so I think that for me as a filmmaker, and answering your question, what does it mean to engage with the New York Times, even as an institution, as a historical institution, as a journalistic institution? For me, it brings into question, what are facts? And how do we prove things like racism in a system that makes that very difficult? How can, as an artist and a filmmaker, I address ambiguity and address the gray area, and get people to understand that emotionality, that things that are a little bit less tangible, that the idea of evoking something is just as meaningful, just as critical as a form of communication and understanding.
Yeah, and you know, I think on our end, you know, I've always seen, and I think one of the things that I've loved so much about what Kathleen and Lindsay and Andrew were able to do with OpDocs, you know, to me, when you watch if you were to survey those films, I think it'd be you'd kind of get very quickly that, you know, the way they construe documentary it's almost like creative treatment of reality, right? Finding ways to kind of approach things. Some filmmakers take, kind of almost like novelistic approaches to reality, or finding ways to, find a very specific lens or angle, or even just like whether it be the selection of subjects for whatever story you're trying to tell. I think in our case, this question of, calling into question a utopian city and utopian experiment that is so very much like American. To me, I wanted to do something that, I guess wasn't so dissimilar from some of like my favorite stories that I see in the paper, right? Like when you read like Nellie Bowles' stories, or you read like Taylor Lorenz's stories, or, like reporters who are able to find and craft these like really intricate, beautiful pieces around specific subjects. I guess like, even calling them like human interest, I feel like does them a disservice, because I think you can do so much. And I think like Garrett's work and Father Soldier's Son, I think are like just testaments to this, of being able to kind of like examine a much broader and subject, but through the lens of the personal. And to me, I think, working with Kathleen on like a much, on a project with a much larger canvas became very interesting, because I think the kinds, I guess the approach of how we were trying to make this film was, I like respect and admire, and I'm like, jealous of journalists, because I feel like they are equipped with such a different toolkit than I am. I tend to just, I love looking at photo books and references and try to kind of make the, for our film, how do we kind of get the audience to like inhabit a place rather than just kind of looking at it from a distance or remove. So I think, working with Kathleen, there were a lot of considerations we would always kind of have to think about, how, if this is sort of a creative treatment of reality, what are some things that we can do? What are some things we can't do? Can we make a storm? If we filmed a bunch of things that, and I feel like this is kind of the funny part about documentary, when you've seen so many of them and you know how they're made, it's like if you film a storm that happened on like 10 different days and very specific things happen in that specific storm, and then you kind of just try and cheat it and cut it all together to look like it happened in one go. I mean, sometimes I guess the emotional kind of qualities of that may make sense for the logic of the film, but sometimes they really won't. And I think honoring sort of what happens in a specific moment, and kind of, I guess, more like, objectively treating reality in certain places, was a big, I think was a big thing that we were doing with this film, trying to take something that was more rooted in the emotional, but also finding ways to, ground it in some sort of objective reality. But I'm so curious about you guys, and I think, yeah.
Well, I think like similar to Lance, but opposite, I feel sometimes really jealous of, like, when I look at Garrett and Lance, I really see you guys as filmmakers and artists. And I see this boundary that Katrin and I had, which was we were fortunate that we were working on a story that lent itself to journalistic tenets and to like remaining within chronology and to having some boundaries with our subjects that were appropriate, but also journalistic. Like, I think for Father Soldier Son, the story worked really well, but part of what I'm really proud of and excited to see the New York Times doing is making stories that are accessible to people that don't consider themselves New York Times people. Like, where I come from, we don't get the New York Times. Like, my family was very confused what my job was, to this day. Like, they don't totally understand, what do we do, and how do I see it, and how does it relate to me? And I think that seeing what Kathleen is doing and what OpDocs has done it's about making stories accessible, and it also creates this beautiful space where, like, the rigors and the tenets of journalism, which I really strongly believe in and really want to see protected for the newspaper, there can be a different space where those things are not so, they're a little bit more fluid. Like, I think Garrett I think your relationship with Fox was more collaborative in some ways. And I don't know if that's true, but to me, like, I've had subjects and stories in the past where I really wanted to have more of that. Like, I would have loved to have some of my subjects just because I admired the people that they were. And I want people to see themselves when they see my film or when they see whatever photo essay I'm working on. We're not allowed to show them the thing, like we did show the Aisha's, the film that we made, before it published, because it would have been kind of unethical not to do that. But normally we're not able to show or accept feedback from the people that we work with. And whereas I think that the space that Times Documentaries and Kathleen and OpDocs creates, it takes some of those boundaries down and makes the work more accessible, and more, like, in some ways it's just beautiful in its own way.
I just wanted to add really quickly, I think, Leslie, to that point, the thing that is also just something that came to mind in what you were just sharing is that, and also Kathleen, you had mentioned in terms of like having an opinion in journalism, like, the very act, I think, of just writing is having a perspective, right? And like, we literally are doing that in filmmaking. So it's just kind of another reinforcement of that. And I think that the way in which there are so many aesthetic choices and ways in which an idea or an opinion or perspective is articulated. And sometimes we take that for granted as just being a standard, when in fact it's actually just been maybe the same people who've been writing for hundreds of years, right? Or the same people who've been making films or telling stories. And so I actually think that there's a huge connection and fluidity between these two different formats that we're talking about that really bring into question systems and our history, as a country, and our relationship to journalism, and the way in which we receive information and what stories are covered and how they're covered, right? All of this, I think, cracks a lot of that open just in this cross dialogue.
And also, like, what's considered news and what's considered opinion, and whose work gets put into these different categories is something that I think this documentary work really shows in an interesting way, because one of the debates that was had when I started my new job was, now I'm technically actually in the newsroom. I report to Sam Dolnick. He's a newsroom masthead editor, whereas with OpDocs, I reported to the editorial page editor, which was Opinion. And now these documentaries sort of moving forward, like all your guys' work, like for example, in the review of Time that was in the New York Times, the reviewer wrote that Time was under the OpDocs banner. And I was like, wait, that's not true. And I had to tell them, and there's a correction on the review to say, no, there is no OpDocs banner for feature docs. It's just a New York Times documentary. And when you see like your 3 films just put out there as documentaries, not newsroom or opinion, I think it's an interesting thought experiment to see why these things are all kind of the same. Whereas if you saw Katrin and Leslie's work on the New York Times, previously it was on newsroom. Garrett and Lance, their previous work at the New York Times, was opinion. And I think it sort of speaks to the power of documentary, that you watch a documentary knowing that it has a perspective. There's no veneer of what's the word? Objectivity, the way that I think there is with news. Although I feel that Katrin and Leslie really, really tried so hard to be as objective as possible as they were editing the film, especially. Katrin, I would love for you to jump in and talk about music, because I always think that that's such an interesting story to talk about, how you guys use music in the film.
Yeah. It's a great example of this. And I will say, like, I think that if Les and I were not putting out this film as a New York Times film as journalists, it would have been a different film, actually. Like, we would have said different things that we did not say because we were working, we are in the newsroom. Like, so we were representing the New York Times newsroom in this film, and that was at the forefront all the time. But had it not been, it would have been a somewhat different film, perhaps. So the music is an example, right? Like, we, there was a lot of debate in the edit room about how much to use the music to make people feel certain things at certain times, right? And how much do we let the nuance of a moment drive it? There are moments in our film which audience members will interpret completely different ways depending on what their values are, where they sit on the political spectrum, and where their backgrounds are. Some people will be like, yes, this is amazing. And some people will be like, this is the worst thing that could have happened. And so just to let that be and not tell people that it's one thing or another was something that Les and I were really careful with. And that definitely was something that we debated with the music that's playing underneath, scenes like that.
Kathleen, first of all, I just want to interject really quickly for everyone watching. Please submit your questions on Pathable or through the chat in Zoom, and we'll try to integrate them as they come in. But in the meantime, Kathleen, I wanted to come back to you a little bit to kind of tease this out some more, because there are some really interesting phrases that I've been hearing here. The human and emotional experience, the creative treatment of reality, the abstraction around the facts, so many more beautiful ways that everyone here has described the storytelling in the work. As you sit kind of in the middle and in a way as a gatekeeper between the visual storytelling and the newsroom, how do you understand those expressions in the context of newsworthiness and news and information?
So, well, on the question of newsworthiness, I think my bar is a story going to provoke a strong emotional response? That was always my bar when I was reviewing OpDoc pitches. Like, if you read a pitch and you're like, yeah, that's interesting, that's not going to be a good film. When you read a pitch, you should feel happy, angry, confused in a deep way. Like film, I think at its core, like all art, like the basic thing it should do is like make you feel something. And that's a very different bar than news, right? Like, news has to be like information that's important that people need to get. And so the bar for a documentary is completely different than for a news article. Like, it's just, you can't even compare it. So I would say that, and then can you repeat can you ask the first part of your question again? I've already forgotten it, sorry.
Well, it was kind of a roaming question, but I'm just wondering about a little bit more about kind of your role between the artistic expression and the news production. I'm sort of seeing you as sitting in the middle. How do you understand how to balance those two priorities, and how do they influence each other, either in the documentary storytelling or in the newsroom?
So, okay, so news, so I wouldn't say that I'm trying to balance news, because news it's completely its own animal. News is like information that's got to get out there. Documentary, what we're balancing is artistry and storytelling with adhering to journalistic rigor. So I think journalistic rigor means ethics. There's different ways that subjects can be treated. Like, for example, in the Hillary Clinton documentary, the footage was mostly shot by the Hillary campaign, and the filmmaker had to license the footage from the Hillary campaign, and Hillary had creative say in that documentary. The New York Times would never be involved in something where the subject had creative say over the film, right? So that's an example of like something that goes too far. But the ways in which you work with subjects in documentary is very different than how you're allowed to work with subjects when you're creating an article for the New York Times. So like what Leslie was talking about collaboration with her subject, like how Garrett worked with Fox in Making Time, is very different from the way that Leslie and Katrin would have worked with the Aishas, right? And the thing that is, I think, really important to say is that this is a case-by-case basis. Like, I don't have like bullet points of like, these are the rules for making documentaries with the New York Times. The thing that I've learned is that, when I was first given this incredible opportunity to make documentaries for the New York Times, there was a lot of ways that we could have done it. We could have put a little bit of money into a lot of projects and like had our name on a ton of stuff. But that very quickly I realized was like a terrible idea, because anything that has the New York Times on it, number one, is going to get way more scrutiny. And number two, it has to be something that feels like it's a part of everything else we do, from like Maggie Haberman on down, in terms of really reflecting the institution. And that the only way that I could ensure that these documentaries felt like part of this, the larger project of the New York Times, is to be like super involved. And as Lance and Garrett and Leslie and Katrin can all attest to, like, I knew all the pieces of these projects from in like an intimate way. I sort of got in there to ask questions about certain scenes and how things were put together, and like, whether or not it was chronology or, fact checking. Like, we talked about all of these decisions, and each project had its own set of issues. I mean, Lance's film is not verite, fly on the wall documentary filmmaking. I mean, Garrett's isn't either, but Lance, I think, we talked a lot about how Lance was telling that story in terms of the scenes in the film. And, with Garrett, it was like we had worked together on Alone, and really sort of, I think, in making that short, had come up with like a dialogue that worked for both of us, where, I mean, Garrett, feel free to disagree, but I feel like we sort of figured out a way where it's like, okay, this is the style of filmmaking that Garrett wants to do. And here's sort of like the basic questions that I have as a viewer and as the New York Times about how the film is made and what's happening in it. But and that level of collaboration, like, not every filmmaker is going to want it. And I think with Leslie and Katrin, it was a bit different. Like, I had honestly been aware of Father Soldier Son. It went on for 9 years. You know, I was brought in like in the last year, basically, once, you know, the Netflix thing came together. The bosses at the times were like, well, we need someone to like produce this and find them a production company and an editor and like help them get it to the finish line, you know? So I really didn't have as much of a role creatively with Katrin and Leslie, how I did with Garrett and Lance from the beginning. So it was a little bit different there, but all that to say, like, the only way that I can ensure these documentaries meet the sort of journalistic standards and excellence of the New York Times is to be involved with making them. Like, we're not in documentary just to like get our brand out there. Like, that's not why we're doing it. We really see this as like an opportunity to expand our storytelling wings as an institution. That's sort of a cheesy metaphor, but that really is what it is. So it's like getting our hands dirty and talking through these things. Katrin, you want to jump in?
I just want to underline something that Lance said, which is that, you know, print journalism has a long and rich tradition of narrative journalism. I mean, not just print, but like if we think of sort of traditional New York Times, we think of print. But, you know, print, audio, like narrative journalism has been happening for a really long time. And I think a lot of what we're doing in documentary is, I mean, that's what it is. It's narrative journalism. And you can push the journalism to different degrees and it can become art, or it can, it certainly can be outside of what would be okay at the New York Times, obviously, but lots of really creative, incredible, like storytelling has emotionally driven storytelling has been happening at the New York Times. And I mean, that's why I wanted to be a journalist, is because I was reading Alma Guillermo Prieto, and like Catherine Boo when I was in college, and it was their journalism that made me want to become a journalist, and that was all storytelling and emotionally driven.
Yeah, I think to Garrett's point, I think though part of what's beautiful about the combination of films that are represented here, though, is challenging who gets to tell those narrative stories and when and from whose perspective.
Absolutely. Although Alma Guillermo Prieto is not, your sort of typical, who she was writing in the New Yorker, but absolutely journalism is going through this reckoning right now. I mean, like not just in the big feature projects, but at every level as it needs to, right?
Absolutely. So we have a question from the audience, which is actually a pretty good segue from what Kathleen has been talking about, but for the filmmakers, continuing this thread about this idea of balancing or not balancing, has there been a situation in which you felt like you had to compromise either your creativity or editorial standards because of one or the other? Or felt challenged by the two priorities?
I'll hop in. I mean, I'd say like not just, even though obviously there's, as Kathleen was saying, there's a distinction between like where the departments fall under. As like a filmmaker and not as a journalist, I mean, no, I'd say no pretty. I mean, obviously like there are considerations and there are always conversations, but I think, when Kathleen's saying there's not like a bullet point or a mandate that says you can't do this, you can do this, like, if anything, I feel like in like 99.9% of all instances, I think Kathleen has worn like a storyteller hat more, than kind of saying you can't or you can do this. It's always kind of coming from like a gut, instinctual, emotional place of like, this is working for me, this isn't working, ethically, what's going on here? How did you capture this? What are you doing? And I think, as Kathleen said, like the film we made in some ways, I don't think I think we all kind of have as audience members and seeing like what kinds of documentaries are awarded certain things, historically, like I think most people have this idea or conception of documentary as something that is particularly observational or sort of objective or is newsy, which I think actually does kind of a great disservice to a lot of the other work that can kind of happen within that label. I think the film that we've made is a film that like, it feels maybe more akin to like a narrative film just because it doesn't have a lot of the documentary conventions. And even the way we were making it, was a true, tried and true collaboration with the subjects. It was almost like we were, riffing on like the reality of all of their situations, and we were coming up with, we were capturing things that were happening in their lives in very contained, ways. But no, I think like, in terms of my own voice as a filmmaker and as someone who is continuing to learn all the time and grow as, and try and figure out what and how my voice kind of comes across on screen. I think like with Lindsay, with Kathleen, obviously, with Andrew, with the whole team there, it's always been a question of, especially in short form too, how can you tell the story in the most concise way while like how can we be additive rather than, rather than kind of more, I don't know, draconian in the ways you can kind of operate.
So we have just a few minutes left, about 13, I think. But a couple more. I was
going to answer this too, and I want to hear what you.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
I was
go ahead.
going to jump in.
All right, I didn't catch that.
Just because I do think that the question of collaboration kind of feeds into that a little bit, and my experience working with every film I've made, actually, regardless of kind of how it's qualified or where it ends up being seen, always starts off with a series of questions, and that first question is typically like, specifically in the case of time, why do you want to make this film? Why is having cameras around you to make this documentary going to be useful to you? What is it going to say or offer to the larger world? And then I feel my job is to then translate that into my own vision. And so I think that's where the collaboration part comes in, where that's a different process, I think, for me than going out and looking for a story per se, or thinking about my witnessing or my participation in the events of a family's life as access. It is more about how can I understand the basic premise of why we're doing this. And then it's my job as a director and as a visual storyteller to a certain extent to translate that within my own vision. And so I think then this question of how literal something might be, I've been incredibly lucky to be able to work with people like Kathleen and Lindsay and Andrew and Concordia, who I think know who I am and where I'm interested in going. And a great example would be like, I have an extreme aversion to like lower thirds text. Like there's just something, and it comes up every time on every project I've ever made that is sort of going, a part of a specific platform. And I have to ask myself, well, why? Like, why do I have an aversion to that? What, as a filmmaker, is that actually triggering for me? And I think Jeffrey Scholar, who's an educator and writer, he wrote a book called I'm actually forgetting right now, but look him up, Jeffrey Scholar. But he writes a lot about how when you look at, for instance, like Charles Burnett's films, and you look at Killer of Sheep, there's no like explicit mention of how the American history and the enslavement of millions of people have a trickle-down effect and are very much still entrenched in how people are moving through space in this present moment. There's no lower thirds explaining that, right? We understand, though, just through the visual makeup, just through the way in which we're navigating space and working with people, that that history and the past is connected to the present moment. And that's where I think it starts to also get really interesting in terms of like, how can we, and that's part of the challenge, I think, as filmmakers, is how do you offer context? How do you understand that we are 360-degree beings, and that any moment is an accumulation of all the moments that happened before it, from hundreds of years to seconds prior, and that is what gives us meaning to that current situation. I'm interested in trying to illustrate that and show that in a way that is true to how we actually experience things in the real world, which is without the benefit of text necessarily. And it's not that there's a right way to do it or a wrong way to do it, but to answer your question, I think my own path has been very much about how can I work through those challenges in a way that really feels that it's reflective of how we actually move through space. And sorry, the last thing I'll say about that is that if I can accomplish that in a way, it also offers a template for how people can feel compassion for each other when they're in the grocery store, right? Or when they're walking down the street, when they don't have information that's telling them how they're supposed to understand something, and they have to use their own intuition and their own understanding of where they are in that current moment. And this is a familiar person. that I saw in that film and they didn't give me the context, how can that be triggering for me trusting something I don't explicitly know? Sorry if that was like a soapbox moment.
No, that, I love that, Garrett, because it's true. You never want to have lower thirds, much to the consternation of many people. And I was always like, she doesn't want lower thirds. Like, that's just how, you know, but now that I really hear that, it's interesting because one of the big different, like when print reporters watch documentaries, and I know this from sitting in a million rough cut screenings with my print colleagues, they always say, we need more context. What's going on here? We need more information, because traditional print journalism is just information. And I think one of the ways in which documentary and traditional print journalism are different is that it's about transmitting emotional truths that come across on screen that play and don't need the context. And whenever we would have these conversations with print editors, we would say, no, but this film is still going to work for audiences without the context. Like, it's going to work without the text card, like, please trust us. And it does, like that. If it's a good film, it will. So I just wanted to add in that little comment.
Kathleen, can I ask you to kind of expand on that in the other direction? Do you think, so the kind of traditional journalism that you're talking about has been around for a long time. Do you think that there is room for emotional reality to now become a bigger part of that reporting?
Well, I will say that I don't think you can paint journalism or print reporting with one brush.
Sure.
There's such a range. I mean, the New York Times right now is at kind of an interesting moment around that conversation as it relates to the 1619 Project and the internal dissent that we all saw from the opinion pages, between the opinion pages in the magazine. And, you know, whatever you think of that particular instance, I think what it shows is there's a lot of debate around how you tell a story in the right way and the best way, and what journalism is, and the role of objectivity. Is objectivity even a thing? I mean, even objectivity, which I think many people have assumed was like one of the core values of journalism, you know, is debated. So is the idea that there's two sides. That is pretty much been thrown out the window at this point. So I think we're in a really interesting moment where, you know, facts are being questioned and you know, what is truth and all of that. But I think my perspective on that is, if you have a good story, people have an innate sense of if something makes sense and is truthful and comes together, and whether it doesn't. Like, if something really just passes the smell test, and all these different ways in which stories are being told, whether it's in documentary or it's in a podcast or it's in a long magazine narrative, are equally valid. And I think that's like the message of this moment. The articles on the front page don't have the monopoly on truth.
I just want to add one thing. I think we also can't paint objective truth with one brush, right? There's different. So, you know, one thing is how an article is framed and whether we think this is a story, but that's not a story. This is all being intensely debated, and thank God, right? But there is another, you know, I did a lot of the sexual harassment reporting that we did a couple of years ago. And let me tell you, like, just because someone tells you something happened to them, it doesn't mean that it did, unfortunately, right? And so we actually have to interrogate, and that is our job as journalists. And this whole idea of like, your mother says she loves you, check it out, is something that we really have to do. And when we don't do that, we can really spread mistruths, and we can be co-opted. So I just want to like put in a plug for that as we're like, there, objectivity isn't one thing, but there are facts, and people do tell lies. And you know, one of our basic jobs as journalists is to see when people are telling lies. So
how do you though, Kat, sorry, I'm just so fascinated. This is where I think it's like, I could talk for days and days with you about this, because I really want to understand and learn as well. But I think in the context of some of the issues, like, you know, when we think about race, then it's like, how does one, I mean, I worked on a show, for instance, where the whole premise of it was mean, you look at the several, I'm not even going to mention one specific. I mean, Diallo is one episode, for instance. I was working on a show about Diallo, and it was very clear what happened in New York. But then when you tried to actually speak with people about what happened, I realized there was this abstract understanding of like what racism was, and like, how is it possible to prove racism? How do you prove microaggressions with sexual harassment? I mean, how do we tie those things to fact? I mean, at the end of the day, how does one determine a fact, or like, right? I don't know. That's what
well, I think it's a spectrum. I think that there is just a total spectrum in terms of like what is truth, because one, you know, if we're talking about, you know, racism, for example, and the experiences of racism, that is so, there's just no way to be like objective about it. I completely agree with you. But if someone is saying to you, this happened to me and this person raped me, I mean, we've seen journalists actually get co-opted, and we, you know, look at what happened with the Rolling Stone story. Like there have been times when, you know, people have made allegations that were simply not true, that are objectively not true. And so that's what I'm talking about. That's what I mean when I say that objectivity isn't like, it's not one thing either, almost. Like we have to like, because absolutely, like how journalists have framed stories and what has been considered a story versus not a story. I mean, I'm so grateful that finally we are doing some excavation around that and like rethinking that. That has been very long overdue, right? But at the same time, we can't throw out this whole notion of truth. There is also truth.
Even like in the I remember when we were fact checking my film, there's a subject in the film who is kind of like, he's a trickster, and he's kind of like a chronic liar. Like his whole life has been sort of like a construction of an elaborate, or maybe not so elaborate construction of lies. So I remember when we were fact checking, it's like, how do you fact check like a liar? I mean, there's obviously ways you can do it. And I think a big part of it, I think, is like what you're saying is also, you do need context, or at least you need to understand, you know, if you just present, you know, one line that this specific subject is saying without any context, then obviously there's that, you know, the viewer has no orientation to understand what it is that is actually happening. But I remember just thinking, like, similar to Garrett, I was like, wow, like I remember actually just talking with our fact checker about this, like, how do you do this? I'm kind of like, you know, it's kind of like you know, almost like an investigative report. Someone needs to make like a paranoia thriller or something from the perspective.
I think that is probably why you were all asked to be here for this. That's a good segue. And we are wrapping in 1 minute. So I just want to say thank you to everyone here for your time. It sounds like we have got our topic for next year's panel. Hopefully we can all come back for that. Thank you for the really rich conversation. There is so much more that we didn't get to, so I hope everyone here has a chance to go out and see the films. And thank you to Double Exposure for having us.
Thanks for hosting.
Thanks for having us. And I just want to call out Kate Sinclair, who fact-checked Garrett and Lance's film.
Yeah.
Kate, you rock. Yes.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Be safe.
Everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.